Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little stranger than your average bedtime tale. The damp, whispering, deeply questionable world of history's forgotten cults. Not the ones you've already seen a dozen documentaries about. No, tonight we are wandering way back into the dusty corners of the past, to the sects, saviors, and self-appointed messiahs that history quietly swept under the rug and hoped you would never find. A huge and sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas genuinely shape what happens here, and this channel only grows because of the strange and wonderful things you send my way. So if you enjoy these late-night wanders through the weirder pages of history, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it is always 2 a.m. somewhere. And if you would rather drift off with just your ears, the channel is now on Spotify too, linked down in the description. And if you'd like a little more, membership is already available on the channel, which gives you access to 8 hours of ad-free video to drift off to, uninterrupted whenever you like. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable. Let's pause and wonder for a second. Have you ever wondered what actually makes a person hand over their life savings, their house, and their good sensible shoes to a man in a bathrobe who insists the world ends on Thursday? Ever met someone so weirdly persuasive that you almost bought the timeshare? Could you resist a warm bowl of soup, a matching robe, and a group that finally thinks you are special? Would you last a week on the compound before you started asking why the leader gets the big tent? And now, congratulations! You have just been handed a candle, a robe 2 sizes too big, and a prophet who is absolutely certain the end is near, but only for the doubters. Sleep well. Before we meet the prophets and the poor souls who followed them, let's talk recipe, because every disturbing cult in history was baked from roughly the same 3 ingredients. Take one charismatic leader with unshakable eye contact. Add a group of tired, lonely or frightened people who just want somebody to tell them everything will be fine. Fold in a promise so big it could not possibly be true, and bake under the warm glow of "we are the only ones who truly understand." That is it. That is the whole cookbook. And the unsettling part, the part that keeps historians up at night, is how ordinary the followers usually were. Not fools, not lunatics, just people who took one wrong turn at a very persuasive smile. Picture the leader for a moment. He is rarely the frothing madman you imagine. He is calm. He listens. He remembers your name and the thing you said about your mother, and he brings it up 3 weeks later like it mattered, which no one else in your life has ever done. It is the oldest trick there is, and it works, because it is not entirely a trick. He does make you feel seen. That is the terrible efficiency of the whole enterprise. Loneliness is the door, and every prophet in this story knew exactly where the handle was. Then comes the promise, and the promises are magnificent. The world is ending, but only for the wrong sort of people. The dead will rise. The wealthy will fall. You, specifically you, have been chosen out of all the billions of ordinary souls to be part of something that finally means something. It is flattery dressed in scripture, and it lands like a warm meal after a long, cold day. Nobody ever recruited a follower by promising them a slightly better than average Tuesday. And here is where modern life should make you nervous rather than smug. You like to think you would spot it. You would notice the red flags, the strange rules, the leader with the suspiciously large tent. But the red flags never arrive on the first day. On the first day there is only soup, and kindness, and a group of smiling people who seemed genuinely delighted you came. The rules arrive slowly, one gentle inch at a time, each one just a little more than the last, until you look up one morning and realize you have signed over the house and cannot quite remember when you agreed to it. It is the same mechanism that gets you 3 episodes deep into a show you did not mean to watch, only with considerably higher stakes. Historians have a word for the moment it all falls apart, and it is a wonderfully deflating one. They call it disconfirmation, which is the polite academic term for the day the world stubbornly refuses to end on schedule. You would think that would be the end of it. Prophet wrong, spell broken, everybody home for tea. But the strangest finding in all of cult research is that failure often makes belief stronger, not weaker. The mind would simply rather rewrite the calendar than admit it gave away its good sensible shoes for nothing. So keep that recipe in mind as we wander tonight, because you will taste it again and again in 100 different kitchens across 100 different centuries. Same 3 ingredients, same warm glow, same quietly astonished followers. And our first kitchen is one of the oldest, and by far the rowdiest, so let's begin in ancient Rome, where the wine flowed a little too freely. Let's begin in ancient Rome, where a secretive wine-soaked cult of the god Bacchus grew so wild that the Senate itself got involved, which is really saying something for a civilization that considered gladiator brunch a family outing. The Bacchanalia started innocently enough as women's religious festivals, all torches and grape juice and pleasant hillside worship. But by the 2nd century before the Common Era, rumours swirled of midnight gatherings, secret initiations and behaviour that made even hardened senators clutch their togas. In the year 186 before the Common Era, Rome cracked down hard, executing thousands and banning the rites across Italy. It remains one of the earliest recorded moral panics in Western history, and proof that people have been nervous about their neighbours' religious mixes for a very long time. To understand why Rome lost its collective composure, you have to understand the setting. These were not tidy daytime services with a programme and a collection plate. They were held at night, in groves and hidden halls, lit by smoking torches thick with the smell of spilled wine and crushed vine leaves and warm bodies packed close in the dark. Drums pounded. People danced until the dancing stopped meaning anything. And crucially, the whole thing was secret, which to a Roman senator was practically a confession of guilt all by itself. A Roman could tolerate almost anything except not knowing exactly what was happening and who was in charge of it. The historian Livy, writing much later and clearly enjoying himself enormously, described the cult as a spreading contagion of vice, complete with lurid tales of conspiracy, forgery, poisoning and murder committed under cover of the rites. Now, Livy was writing decades after the fact with an obvious moral to sell, so we should take his breathless account roughly the way you would take a neighbourhood rumour that grows an extra body every time it is repeated over the fence. Some of it was surely true. Most of it was surely the ancient equivalent of a very concerned group chat. What set the panic off, at least in the official version, was the claim that the cult had grown large, organised and full of men as well as women, meeting frequently and swearing binding oaths to one another. That last detail is the one that truly terrified the Senate. Secret oaths meant loyalty to something other than the Roman state, and a Rome that could not command your first loyalty was a Rome that did not sleep well at night. Wine they could forgive. A rival chain of command they absolutely could not. So the Senate acted with the swift, thorough overreaction that empires do so well. They issued a decree, a copy of which actually survives carved in bronze, restricting the cult to tiny approved gatherings that required special permission from the Senate itself. Imagine having to file paperwork with the government to hold a prayer group, and imagine the government granting perhaps 5 worshippers at a time and no shared treasury. That was mild compared to the rest of it. The crackdown swept across Italy, and ancient sources claim that those executed outnumbered those merely imprisoned, which puts the death toll well into the thousands. And here is the deadpan irony that history serves up for free. Bacchus, the god of wine and release and letting go, presided over the founding disaster of organized paranoia. The Romans came to fear him not because he made them drink, but because he made them gather. The party was never really the problem. The guest list was. Which brings us to another set as worshippers who terrified respectable Rome, though for a very different reason entirely. Not far from the wine cult stood a stranger sight still, the Galli, the wandering castrated priests of the goddess Cybele. These were men who, in a state of ecstatic devotion, gave up something most men are fairly attached to, all in service of the great mother goddess of Phrygia. They dressed in bright robes, wore heavy jewellery, dyed their hair, and paraded through Roman streets banging drums and cymbals in a whirl of noise and colour. Romans found them fascinating and faintly alarming in equal measure, which is the reaction most people have to a parade that will not stop. It was devotion turned all the way up, and then a little further than anyone was comfortable with. The goddess they served came to Rome by invitation, which makes the whole affair even more delightfully awkward. During a dark stretch of a long war, a prophecy told the Romans that victory required them to bring the great mother of the gods from Asia Minor into the city. So they did, importing her sacred stone with great ceremony and installing her on a hill with all honours. What they perhaps did not fully appreciate at the time was that the goddess came with staff, and the staff had customs that would make a Roman paterfamilias spill his morning wine straight down his tunic. The central festival was a spring rite of frenzy and grief and rebirth, mourning the death of the goddess's beloved and then celebrating his return. On the most intense day, the sound and the incense and the swirling dance would build and build until, so the ancient sources tell us, a new devotee might be swept up entirely and perform the irreversible act of dedication right there in the heat of the moment. It is difficult to think of a more permanent way to fill out a membership form. There was no cooling off period, no free trial, no gentle first day of soup and smiles. There was only before and after. Once initiated, a priest lived a life the Romans genuinely could not categorize. He was neither the sober citizen soldier the culture idolized, nor a foreigner they could simply dismiss. He was something in between, loud and flamboyant and holy, begging for alms in the streets while telling fortunes and playing music, occasionally lashing himself into a trance for a coin. Respectable Romans passed laws to keep citizens from joining the priesthood, essentially declaring the whole vocation off limits to their own sons, while cheerfully keeping the goddess herself as an honoured guest. They wanted the protection of the Great Mother very much. They just did not want their nephew coming home with a tambourine and a new lease on spiritual life. And yet the cult endured for centuries, spreading right across the empire, its shrines turning up from Britain to the eastern deserts. The Galli were mocked in Roman poetry, gawked at in the streets, and legislated against by nervous magistrates, and none of it made the slightest difference. Devotion that extreme is, in a grim way, unbeatable. You cannot threaten a man with loss when he has already, voluntarily and with symbols, given up more than you could ever take. There is a lesson buried in the noise and the bright robes, and it is one that will echo through this whole strange night. Extreme belief is not fragile. It is often the most durable thing a frightened world ever produces, precisely because it costs so much. The greater the sacrifice a person has already made, the harder it becomes for them to admit it was for nothing. Which is exactly the trap that swallowed our next group whole, a band of martyrs in North Africa who wanted to die so badly they had to be talked out of it. Now we travel to North Africa in the 4th century, where a group of Christian radicals called the Circumcellions decided that the fastest route to heaven was an enthusiastic and preferably immediate death. They roamed the countryside armed with heavy wooden clubs, seeking out confrontations and quite literally begging travellers to martyr them on the spot. Some reportedly threw themselves off cliffs, convinced they were booking express passage to paradise. Imagine being minded of your own business on a country road and having a stranger politely insist you help him meet God. The early church spent a great deal of energy trying to calm these people down, with limited success. To be fair to the Circumcellions, and someone probably should be, they emerged from a genuinely bitter religious feud tearing the region apart. North African Christianity had split over a painful question left behind by an earlier wave of persecution. When the threat had passed, some believers wanted mercy for those who had cracked under pressure, and others wanted a hard, pure church that never forgave a betrayer. Out of that harder faction grew a rougher, rural working-class movement, and out of that grew the wanderers who took purity to its most alarming conclusion. Their name most likely comes from their habit of loitering around rural shrines and the tombs of earlier martyrs, and their whole spiritual imagination was fixed on those honoured dead. Earlier Christians had died gloriously for their faith, and were now, everyone agreed, seated among the saints. The Circumcellions looked at that arrangement and concluded, with a logic that is at least consistent, that the surest way to join them was to get martyred as quickly as possible. Why wait for a hostile empire to do it when a passing stranger and a good cliff top would do the job just as well? This produced scenes that would be comic if they were not so unsettling. Ancient writers describe them accosting travellers and demanding to be killed on the spot, offering the terrified passerby a stark choice: strike me down, or I strike you. Some are said to have crashed pagan festivals for the sole purpose of provoking a lethal response. Others simply climbed to a high place, called on the name of God, and jumped, treating the local geography like a series of doorways to eternity. It gives new and grim meaning to the phrase leap of faith. The great church father Augustine, who lived in the region and had to deal with the mess personally, wrote about them with the weary exasperation of a man who has run entirely out of gentle metaphors. He argued, quite reasonably, that seeking death was not the same as bearing witness, and that God had asked for faithful lives, not a stampede toward the nearest ravine. It was, in essence, one of history's earliest recorded attempts at large-scale crisis counselling, and it did not go especially well. You cannot easily talk someone out of a plan when their plan is the reward. What makes the Circumcellions truly disturbing is not the violence, striking as it was, but the sincerity underneath it. They were not cynics. They were not con artists fleecing the gullible. They were poor, devout, deadly serious people who had followed a beautiful idea straight off the edge of a cliff, sometimes literally. They took the recipe from our first segment, the intoxicating promise of being among the chosen, and they poured in every last drop until there was nothing sensible left in the bowl. And that is the recurring danger with a promise of paradise. It can make this world feel like a waiting room you're impatient to leave. Our next group had no such rush toward death. They had discovered instead a way to enjoy life a great deal more by deciding that sin had simply stopped applying to them. In the sunlit hills of southern France lived the Cathars, a gentle dualist sect who believed the material world was the work of an evil god, and that the truly holy should renounce meat, wealth, and worldly pleasure. They were peaceful, popular, and deeply inconvenient to the Catholic Church, which is a dangerous combination in any century. In the year 1209, a full crusade was launched against them, and at the town of Béziers a commander was said to have given the chilling order attributed to him for centuries to kill everyone and let God sort out the faithful. What followed was decades of bloodshed. The Cathars were not disturbing for what they did, but for what was done to them. Their beliefs, stripped of the horror that came later, were almost serene. They held that two forces governed all of existence, a good god of the spirit and light, and an evil power responsible for the entire physical world, including flesh, money, and the church that owned so much of both. From this they concluded that the goal of life was to free the trapped spirit from the corrupt material trap around it. Their most devoted members, whom their followers revered as the good ones, lived lives of astonishing austerity. No meat, no killing, no lying, no wealth, no comforts of the body. Next to the famously prosperous local clergy, this looked less like heresy and more like an uncomfortable comparison nobody in Rome enjoyed making. That was precisely the problem. The Cathars flourished in the towns and courts of the region, protected by local nobles and admired by ordinary people who could see the difference between a preacher who owned nothing and a bishop who owned a valley. A rival religion that makes your own institution look greedy is not a debate. It is a threat, and it was treated as one. After years of failed persuasion and the murder of a papal official that served as the final spark, a crusade was called against fellow Christians on European soil, which was a genuinely new and terrible idea. The army that marched south was vast, and its opening act at Béziers set the tone for everything after. The town sheltered both Cathars and ordinary Catholics, and when the attackers asked how they were to tell one from the other, the answer that comes down to us, whether truly spoken or later invented, was monstrous in its simplicity. Spare no one. Let heaven identify its own. The town was stormed and its people slaughtered in numbers that shocked even a hardened age, and the campaign that followed dragged on for 2 decades across the whole region. The persecution outlived the war. A new institution was created specifically to root out surviving believers, quietly and thoroughly, one confession at a time, and it would cast a very long shadow over the centuries to come. The last great Cathar stronghold, a mountain fortress perched impossibly high on a crag, held out for months before it finally fell, and more than 200 believers who refused to renounce their faith reportedly walked into the fire together rather than betray it. It is one of the most haunting images this whole grim history has to offer. Here the snark falls silent, because there is nothing funny in it. The Cathars earn their place among the disturbing not through midnight rites or leaps off cliffs, but as the moment the machinery of belief turned on itself and consumed a peaceful people whole. They were, in the end, undone not by their own excess but by their inconvenience, and yet the impulse they represented, the conviction that the material world and its moral rules did not truly bind the enlightened soul, refused to die with them. It surfaced again a century later in a movement that reached the very same conclusion and did something far more comfortable with it. Drifting into the medieval period, we meet the Brethren of the Free Spirit. mystics who arrived at a theological loophole so bold it would make a tax attorney weep with admiration. They believed that once a soul had achieved perfect union with God, it could no longer sin, no matter what the body got up to. You can probably guess where this reasoning led. Church authorities were horrified, hunting the movement across Europe for generations. It is a recurring theme in cult history, the discovery that if you simply declare yourself incapable of wrongdoing, an enormous amount of wrongdoing suddenly becomes available. The idea began, as the most dangerous ideas often do, in a place of real sincerity. Across medieval Europe, there were countless devout men and women straining toward a direct, personal experience of the divine, a union so complete that the ordinary distance between the worshipper and God simply dissolved. That longing was beautiful, and for most it stayed safely within the lines. But a certain strand pushed the logic one fatal step further. If a soul had truly and permanently merged with the perfect and the divine, then how could anything that soul did afterward be called a sin? Perfection cannot fall. The enlightened were, by definition, already home. This is what scholars call antinomianism, which is a magnificent word meaning against the law, and specifically the conviction that moral rules are training wheels for the spiritually unfinished. To the free spirits, commandments were for beginners. They were the fence you needed only until you learned to fly. Having flown, the reasoning went, you could ignore the fence entirely, along with fasting, obedience, property, and most of the other tiresome obligations the church liked to hand out. It was, in effect, a permission slip signed by God and conveniently unavailable for inspection. You will notice this is the exact opposite conclusion the Cathars reach from a not entirely different starting point. Where the Cathars looked at the wicked material world and chose to starve its every appetite, the free spirits looked at their own perfected souls and decided the material world could no longer touch them, so they might as well enjoy it. Same puzzle, wildly different answer, and the second answer came with considerably better dinners. Naturally, the church could not let this stand, and not only for the obvious reasons. A movement that told people they answered to no rule, and no institution was a movement that answered to no bishop either. The hunt was long and diffuse, because the free spirits had no single founder, no headquarters, and no membership roll, only a shared, slippery idea that surfaced in different places under different names for generations. One of the most famous figures associated with the current was a mystic writer who produced a subtle and radiant book about the soul's annihilation into divine love, and who was burned for it in the early 14th century when authorities decided her exquisite theology crossed a fatal line. The truly unnerving part, and the part worth carrying with you into the dark, is how reasonable each step of the argument sounds when you take it slowly. Seek God. Grow closer still. Achieve union. And now that you are one with perfection, surely you are beyond reproach. Every link in that chain is a sentiment a saint might approve. It is only when you reach the end and look back that you see where the whole gentle staircase was quietly leading. Some sects, then, wanted to escape the body's rules. Others wanted to escape its clothing entirely, and reasoned their way there just as earnestly. Which brings us to a group who decided the road back to innocence began with taking absolutely everything off. Some sects wanted robes. The Adamites wanted the opposite. Inspired by a longing to return to the innocence of Adam and Eve before the fall, these medieval believers held their gatherings entirely without clothing, convinced they had recovered a purity the rest of us lost somewhere around the apple. A radical branch flourished in Bohemia in the early 15th century, living on an island and raising the alarm of everyone nearby. Eventually, the famous one-eyed general Jan Žižka was sent to deal with them, and deal with them he did. It is worth remembering, as you lie warm under your blankets tonight, that at least you are wearing something. The theology, once you sit with it, is oddly touching. The story of the garden had always described a lost state of perfect innocence, a time before shame, before hiding, before the fig leaves came out. Most Christians treated that innocence as gone forever, a paradise sealed behind a flaming sword. The Adamites disagreed. They believed that through the right faith and the right community, a person could be spiritually restored to that original blessed condition, and that a truly restored soul would feel no shame in its own body, because shame itself was a symptom of the fall. Undress, in this framework, was not indecent. It was a certificate of grace. You can see the appeal in a strange way. In a world of endless rules, elaborate hierarchies, and heavy, scratchy layers of both cloth and obligation, here was a promise of radical simplicity. Strip it all away, the garments and the guilt together, and stand in the world exactly as the first humans were meant to. It was the medieval equivalent of throwing out every possession you own and declaring yourself finally free, except considerably breezier. The trouble, as ever, arrived when the idea met the neighbours. The most notorious Bohemian branch emerged during a period of ferocious religious upheaval, when a powerful reforming movement had taken up arms and the whole region was a tinderbox of competing zealotries. Within that storm, the Adamites were radical even by radical standards, and their conviction that they alone had recovered true innocence curdled, in some accounts, into a belief that the outside world of the still fallen was fair game. A community that declares everyone else spiritually inferior tends not to remain a quiet island retreat for long. And an island retreat is quite literally what they took. They settled on an island in a river and lived apart, which was meant to keep the fallen world out, and only succeeded in concentrating everyone's suspicion onto one small, easily located dot on the map. The reforming leaders of the wider movement did not regard these naked cousins as a charming eccentricity. They regarded them as an embarrassment and a menace, and they dispatched their formidable blind general, a man who had never lost a battle, to resolve the matter. He resolved it with the thoroughness for which he was famous, and the Bohemian Adamites were effectively wiped out. There is a deadpan lesson tucked into their brief, chilly existence, and it is this. Every one of these movements believed it had found the one true shortcut back to paradise. The Circumcellions found it off a cliff. The Free Spirits found it beyond the reach of law. The Adamites found it at the bottom of the laundry basket. Each was utterly convinced. Each was also, it turned out, extremely findable by armed men who disagreed. And speaking of armed men and impossible dreams of purity, our next figure did not wait on an island to be found. He gathered thousands, took to the mountains, and dared an entire church to come and get him. In the early 14th century, a preacher named Fra Dolcino gathered thousands of followers in the mountains of northern Italy, promising a new age of poverty, equality, and the swift downfall of a corrupt church. For a few years his apostolic brethren lived as holy outlaws in the high valleys, surviving on faith, foraging, and the occasional raid. But an armed movement that promises to abolish the wealthy tends to attract the attention of the wealthy. The church raised a crusade, the mountains ran red, and Dolcino met an end so gruesome we will approach it gently. His story lingered for centuries as a warning wrapped in a legend. The movement he inherited had begun a generation earlier with a man who preached a return to the simple, propertyless life of the very first followers of Christ. No possessions, no fine buildings, no fat clergy, just wandering apostles owning nothing and answering only to God. It was a message that landed hard among the poor of a region where the gap between the fasting preacher and the feasting bishop had grown obscene. The church, unsurprisingly, did not care for a grassroots campaign whose central pitch was that the church itself was the problem, and the founder was eventually burned. Enter Fra Dolcino, who took the smouldering remains of the movement and fanned them into something far larger and far more dangerous. He was, by all accounts, a genuinely gifted preacher, and he added a thrilling ingredient the recipe from our first segment always loves, a timetable. He announced that history was moving through great ages, that the corrupt reign of the wealthy church was about to end, and that a purified new age was arriving imminently, ushered in by the humble and the poor. To people crushed by poverty, this was not abstract theology. It was a promise that their suffering was almost over and that they were on the winning side of eternity. Thousands followed him into the high valleys, and for several years they held out there, an entire alternative society perched in the cold and the stone. They were not passive. When winter and hunger bit, they came down and raided the surrounding countryside for supplies, which is a reliable way to turn even sympathetic neighbours into informants. A movement can survive being hated by the powerful for quite a while. It struggles to survive being resented by the ordinary people whose granaries it keeps emptying. The end came the way these ends tend to. A crusade was preached against them, an army assembled, and the followers were pushed higher and higher into ever more brutal terrain through a horrific winter. Starvation and cold did much of the work an army would otherwise have to. When the final assault came, the surviving Dulcinians were overwhelmed, and Fra Dolcino was captured alive, which in that era was worse news than dying in the fight. His execution was made deliberately prolonged and public, a piece of grim theatre intended to be watched, remembered, and repeated as a warning. We will leave the details in the fog where they belong. His legend, however, refused to be executed alongside him. Dolcino became a figure that echoed down the centuries, remembered by some as a dangerous fanatic, and by others as an early martyr for equality and against a hoarding church. A famous poet of the age even placed a grim reference to him in verse, ensuring his name outlived nearly everyone who condemned it. That is the strange afterlife of the holy rebel. Crush the man, and you may accidentally cast the legend in bronze. But if Dolcino's followers whipped themselves into the mountains for a coming new age, our next group whipped themselves quite a bit more literally and marched their bleeding new age straight down the main street of every town they could find. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the late 1300s, terrified people reached for the only cure they could imagine, which was to punish themselves before God could get around to it. Bands of flagellants marched from town to town, stripping to the waist and whipping their own backs bloody in the public square, chanting and weeping as horrified crowds watched. They believed their suffering might convince heaven to lift the plague. Instead, moving from town to town while bleeding openly did roughly what you would expect for the spread of disease. The Pope eventually condemned the movement, which by then had become a travelling emergency of its own. You have to sit for a moment inside the sheer scale of the terror to understand any of it. A sickness had arrived that killed with breathtaking speed and no discernible logic, taking a third or more of entire populations, emptying villages, leaving the dead unburied because there was no one left well enough to dig. Doctors were useless. Prayers in the ordinary way appeared to be useless. And in that void of explanation, the medieval mind reached for the one story it trusted completely, that God was angry, that this was punishment, and that the only remedy for punishment was to punish yourself first, sincerely and visibly and hard. So they organized, and the organization was oddly precise. A band of penitents would commit to a fixed pilgrimage lasting a set number of days, tied to a sacred figure and a holy count, marching from town to town and performing their bloody ritual in each. They carried scourges, often knotted and studded with small iron points, and at the appointed moment they would bare their backs and strike themselves in solemn rhythm while chanting hymns, sometimes throwing themselves face down on the ground in the shape of a cross. Whole towns turned out to watch, weeping along, some joining, all of them desperate for any sign that heaven was listening. For a while, the crowds loved them. Here at last were people doing something, anything, in the face of the incomprehensible. The flagellants offered the two things terror craves most, an explanation and a task. The plague was punishment, and the task was penance, and you could see the penance happening right there in the square, red and rhythmic and unmistakably serious. It was, in a bleak way, the most engaged public health campaign the era could muster. The problems, however, stacked up quickly. A parade of bleeding strangers wandering into every town they could reach was, in retrospect, an almost perfectly designed engine for spreading exactly the disease it hoped to cure. Worse, from the perspective of the authorities, the movement began to slip its leash. These were laymen conducting their own rituals, offering their own forgiveness of sins, and drawing enormous loyal crowds without any priest, bishop, or blessing involved. In places they turned on the established clergy, and in the ugliest episodes their fervour curdled into violence against scapegoated communities blamed for the plague. A grassroots movement of self-appointed holy men answering to no one is a phrase you will notice keeps recurring tonight, and it never ends quietly. Eventually the Pope condemned the whole enterprise and moved to suppress it, and the marching bands faded, though the impulse behind them never really did. The flagellants are disturbing not because they were cruel to others, though at their worst they were, but because they turned that cruelty inward with total sincerity, convinced that the more it hurt, the more it helped. It is the recipe again, taken to the skin. A frightened world, a confident answer, and a price paid in blood. But if the flagellants merely marched through the towns, our next movement did something no group in this story had dared. It captured one, sealed the gates, and tried to build heaven inside the walls. Now we reach one of the strangest episodes in European history, the Anabaptist takeover of the German city of Münster in the 1530s. What began as a radical religious reform movement spiraled into a self-declared holy kingdom, ruled by a former tailor named John of Leyden, who crowned himself king, took multiple wives, and declared the end of the world imminent. Money was abolished, dissent was punished by death, and the city was sealed off as authorities besieged it from without, and paranoia devoured it from within. When the walls finally fell, the leaders were tortured, and their bodies hung in iron cages from a church tower, where the cages remain to this day. It is the cautionary tale that all others measure themselves against. It grew out of the enormous religious upheaval convulsing Europe at the time, when the old church was being challenged everywhere, and radical new movements were sprouting faster than anyone could count them. Among the most radical were those who rejected the baptism of infants, and insisted that true baptism could only be chosen by a grown believer, hence the name that stuck to them. Most were peaceful, sober people who wanted only to worship in their own way. But into the boiling city of Münster came a more feverish strain, preaching that this very city, right here, right now, was to be the New Jerusalem, the one spot on earth that would survive the coming end of all things, That promise, arriving in a nervous city at a nervous moment, worked like a magnet. Believers poured in from the surrounding lands to be present at the end of the world, while unbelievers were pressured to convert or leave. Within a short span, the radicals held the whole city, and the experiment in building heaven on earth began in earnest. At first it wore the clothes of idealism. Private property was abolished, and goods were to be shared in common, food distributed by the community, the old money declared worthless. It was a genuine attempt to live as one holy family with no rich and no poor, and for a brief moment it might even have looked inspiring from a safe distance. Then the outside world did what the outside world always does to a walled city full of people, declaring themselves the only survivors of the apocalypse. The local prince-bishop, whose city this technically was, raised an army and laid siege, and the gates were sealed with everyone still inside. And a sealed city ruled by apocalyptic certainty is a pressure cooker with the lid welded shut. Leadership passed to the young former tailor, a magnetic and ruthless figure who soon dropped any pretense of shared rule and had himself proclaimed king, dressing in finery amid the growing hunger and issuing decrees with the absolute authority of a man who believed God spoke through him alone. Under the siege, life inside curdled into nightmare. Polygamy was introduced and enforced, dissent became a capital matter, and executions were carried out to keep the faithful faithful and the frightened silent, while the king reportedly dined while the ordinary residents slowly starved. Every promise had inverted. The kingdom of shared plenty had become a starving fortress. The city of the saved had become a prison no one could leave. It is the single most concentrated demonstration in this entire story of what happens when the recipe from our first segment is sealed inside 4 walls and left to cook without air. At last, betrayed from within, the walls were breached. The retribution was merciless, and the executed leaders were placed in iron cages hoisted high on the tower of a city church as a warning that all could see for miles. The cages are still there, empty now, hanging against the sky centuries later. They have watched over that town longer than almost anything else in it. 3 quiet, iron reminders of the night a city tried to become heaven and built something else entirely. After the fever of Münster, some sects learned to keep quiet, and none more successfully than the family of love, founded by a mystic merchant named Hendrik Nicolaes in the 16th century. The familists believed in a hidden inner spirituality and, crucially, in blending invisibly into ordinary society while keeping their true beliefs secret. They attended regular church, paid their taxes, and smiled at their neighbours, all while quietly holding to a faith no one around them suspected. This made them nearly impossible to stamp out, and enormously unnerving to authorities. Sometimes the most disturbing cult is the one you cannot see. You can hardly blame them for the discretion. They arrived in the long, bloody shadow of exactly the sort of catastrophe you just heard about, when a radical religious movement had captured a city, declared the apocalypse, and ended up as 3 corpses in iron cages. Every ruler in Europe had drawn the same lesson, that a sect which gathers loudly and declares itself chosen is a sect to be crushed before it gets ideas. The familists took the opposite lesson entirely. Do not gather loudly, do not declare anything, survive by being unremarkable, and hold the fire on the inside where no magistrate can see it. Their founder was a prosperous merchant, and there is something fitting about that, because the whole enterprise ran on a merchant's instinct for keeping the books quiet and the shopfront respectable. He wrote a stream of mystical books under a modest set of initials, teaching that true religion was an inward matter of divine love filling the soul, and that the outer forms of worship, the church you attended and the rituals you performed, were more or less a costume you could wear to fit in. To a familist, kneeling in the official church on Sunday was not hypocrisy. It was camouflage, and camouflage was survival. This is what made them so maddening to the authorities. There was nothing to raid. No island, no mountain fortress, no walled city, no bleeding parade down the main street. A familist looked exactly like your ordinary tax-paying, pew-warming neighbour, because that is precisely what a familist was, right up until the moment you somehow learned otherwise, which you almost never did. Investigators would occasionally sniff out a cell, extract a few recantations, and congratulate themselves on stamping out the menace, only to have it quietly reappear a county over, unbothered, unburned, and perfectly polite. It helped that their beliefs, whatever else you make of them, did not require anyone to abolish money or storm a city or leap off anything. A faith you can practice entirely inside your own head while nodding along at the official service is a faith that is very hard to catch and even harder to prosecute. How do you put a man on trial for what he privately feels about divine love while he is demonstrably in church every week, doing exactly as he is told? The familists had, in effect, made themselves legally invisible, and they knew it. They drew the usual dark rumours, of course, the ones every secret group attracts, whispers of hidden gatherings and scandalous doctrines, most of it the standard, fearful invention of people unnerved by not being able to see inside. But the familists mostly just endured, spreading quietly through merchant networks and educated households, outlasting the panics and dissolving gently into other movements over time rather than dying in any dramatic blaze. And that is the unsettling gift they leave us with tonight. Not every dangerous idea announces itself with drums and torches. Some simply smile, pay the tax, and take a seat 2 rows behind you. But hope, unlike the familists, does not always stay quiet. Sometimes it erupts across an entire people at once, as it did in the year that a single man convinced half a world the end had finally gloriously come. In the year 1666, a wave of feverish hope swept through Jewish community from Poland to Yemen, all centered on one man, Sabbatai Zevi, who proclaimed himself the long-awaited Messiah. Tens of thousands sold their possessions and prepared for redemption and the journey to the Holy Land. It was one of the largest messianic movements in centuries, and for a brief shining moment it felt unstoppable. Then Ottoman authorities gave Sabbatai a simple choice between death and conversion to Islam, and to the shock of his followers, he chose the turban. The collapse of that hope echoed through communities for generations. To feel the force of it, you have to feel the ache it answered. These were communities that had endured centuries of exile, expulsion and violence, carrying a very old promise that one day a Redeemer would come and gather the scattered home. Waiting was practically the central discipline of the whole tradition. And into that long, patient ache stepped a charismatic and troubled man from the Eastern Mediterranean, given to soaring moods and strange public acts, who began, quietly at first and then openly, to declare that the waiting was over. He was the one. Redemption had a face, and it was his. On his own, he might have burned out as a local eccentric. What turned him into a continental firestorm was a brilliant younger scholar who became his prophet and publicist, crafting the theology, writing the letters, and broadcasting the news along the trade and correspondence routes that stitched the scattered communities together. Word raced from city to city faster than anyone could verify it, and each retelling grew warmer and more certain. The recipe from our first night appears again, but supercharged. A confident voice, an aching audience, and now a communications network to spread the promise at the speed of a galloping courier. The response was extraordinary and, to sober observers, alarming. In town after town, ordinary people were swept into a euphoria of repentance and preparation. Some fasted, some feasted, some engaged in wild acts of penance, and many, convinced they would soon be miraculously transported to the Holy Land, began selling their homes and businesses and settling their affairs. Why tend a shop in the old world when the new one was arriving next spring? It was hope as a kind of controlled demolition, and people cheerfully knocked down their own settled lives to make room for the miracle. Then came the journey that broke it. Sabbatai travelled toward the heart of the Ottoman Empire, where the authorities, less interested in theology than in public order, arrested this man whose followers were talking openly about the end of the current order of the world. They presented him with a stark and famous choice: convert to Islam or die. And the Messiah, the man tens of thousands had reordered their lives around, chose to live. He put on the turban. The shock cannot be overstated. For his followers, it was as if the sun had agreed to rise and then simply declined. Some abandoned the movement in bitter grief and quietly rebuilt the lives they had dismantled. But here is the finding that ties this segment to the very first one: the discovery that a failed prophecy does not always end belief. A remnant refused to let go and reinterpreted the catastrophe itself as part of the plan, deciding the Messiah had descended into the world of the unbelievers on a secret redemptive mission too deep for ordinary minds. Some even followed him into conversion. The dream, disconfirmed in the most public way imaginable, simply grew a new and stranger set of roots. And that is the eerie durability of hope. Denied by the world, it will rewrite the world before it will admit defeat. We will see the same stubborn machinery again and again, though rarely amid the wild uncertainty of a land at war with itself, where nobody could be sure who was a genuine radical and who was merely a rumour. During the chaos of the English Civil War, when the old order had cracked wide open, a shadowy group called the Ranters supposedly emerged, preaching that God lived within everyone, and that sin was therefore an illusion invented by the powerful. Reports told of them cursing, drinking, and shocking respectable society at every turn. What makes the Ranters especially fascinating is that some historians now argue they were exaggerated or even half-invented by a frightened establishment desperate for a villain. Real or not, the panic was real, and it tells us as much about the fears of the age as any confirmed sect ever could. Set the scene, because the setting is the whole point. A king had been overthrown and executed, an event nearly unthinkable a generation earlier. The old machinery of censorship and church discipline had broken down, and suddenly anyone with a strong opinion and access to a cheap printing press could flood the streets with pamphlets. It was a moment of dizzying, terrifying openness in which every settled certainty seemed suddenly up for grabs. And in such moments, societies do two things at once. They generate genuine radicals, and they generate lurid stories about radicals, and it becomes very hard to tell the two apart. The doctrine attributed to the Ranters should sound familiar by now, because you met its ancestors a few centuries back among the free spirits. If God dwells within every person, the reasoning ran, then the divine spark inside you cannot truly sin, and the entire heavy apparatus of moral law is a fraud imposed by the powerful to keep ordinary people frightened and obedient. It is the antinomian loophole reborn in 17th century English, and it arrived at the most destabilizing possible moment, when the powerful had just watched their king lose his head and were in no mood to hear that the moral order was optional. The reports that followed were vivid and scandalized. Ranters were said to swear extravagantly on principle, to drink and carouse as a form of worship, and to declare their freedom from every rule with deliberate theatrical outrageousness. Pamphlets appeared describing their supposed gatherings in tones of horror that read, on close inspection, suspiciously like tones of fascination. There is a particular kind of author who denounces wickedness in loving and exhaustive detail, and the anti-ranter literature had that flavour in abundance. Here is where modern historians raise a careful eyebrow. There was no ranter organisation, no founder, no membership, no headquarters, only a scattering of provocative individuals and an enormous quantity of hostile pamphlets describing a supposed movement. Some scholars now argue that the ranters as a unified sect were substantially a fiction, a convenient bogeyman assembled by a nervous establishment that badly needed a symbol of where all this dangerous new freedom would lead if unchecked. The moral was clear. Loosen the reins even a little, and you get chaos, blasphemy, and men declaring sin abolished in the tavern. Whether they were a real movement, a handful of loud eccentrics, or largely a printed nightmare, the panic did real work. It helped justify a tightening of control, a crackdown on radical printing, and a general reassertion that the moral order was not, in fact, up for grabs. The ranters are disturbing in a wonderfully modern way, because they raise the question of whether the most dangerous cult in a given moment might be the one that exists mainly in the fearful imagination of everyone else. But where the ranters may have been a phantom conjured by grown men's anxieties, our next movement produced something no one could dismiss as invention. Prophecy pouring from the mouths of the very young. In the rugged Cevennes mountains of France in the early 1700s, persecuted Protestants produced something extraordinary and unsettling, waves of ecstatic prophecy delivered by ordinary people, including very small children. Witnesses described young ones falling into trances, speaking in perfect formal French they supposedly could not otherwise use, and foretelling the future. The movement spread as far as London, where it caused a genuine sensation and no small amount of scandal. Whether you saw a miracle or a mass delusion depended entirely on which pew you were sitting in. Either way, a prophesying toddler is a hard thing to argue with. The pressure that produced it was crushing. This was a Protestant community living under a Catholic crown that had decided to stamp out their faith entirely, banning their worship, demolishing their churches, and hunting down their pastors. Deprived of trained ministers and forbidden to gather, a whole population found its religious life driven underground into the hills, where it took on an intense, improvised and highly emotional character. When the official channels of faith are torn away, people do not simply stop believing. They find new channels, and the new channels are often far stranger than the old ones. What emerged was a wave of what the community understood as direct divine inspiration. Ordinary men, women, and remarkably many children would fall into trembling trances, their breathing changing, their bodies shaking, and then begin to speak, delivering warnings, exhortations, and prophecies. The detail that astonished everyone, believers and skeptics alike, was the language. Simple country children who normally spoke only rough local dialect would, in the grip of the trance, reportedly pour out fluent, formal, scriptural French of a kind they had no earthly way of having learned. To their community this was proof. Only heaven could put such words in such young mouths. You can imagine the effect on a persecuted and desperate people. Here, delivered through their own children, was evidence that God had not abandoned them, that the divine was speaking directly, bypassing the priests and the crown and the demolished churches to reach them in the hills. It was enormously consoling and enormously destabilizing at once. prophecy is a thrilling thing to receive and a very difficult thing to govern, because a movement in which anyone might suddenly start speaking for God at any moment has no easy way to decide whose God to obey. The phenomenon eventually travelled. As refugees fled the persecution, some carried the prophetic gift with them, and a small band of these French prophets turned up in London in the early 1700s, where they created a genuine spectacle. Curious crowds gathered to watch the trances and hear the predictions. Sober observers filed skeptical reports, and the whole affair generated pamphlets, mockery, and heated debate. One thing that did not help the cause was a spectacularly public prophecy that a certain dead believer would rise again on a set date, an event that, much like the world's various scheduled endings, declined to occur on cue. And yet the sincerity underneath is undeniable and, in its way, moving. These were frightened, faithful people, stripped of every ordinary support, reaching for the divine through the only vessels left to them, sometimes their own small children. It is a haunting image to carry into the dark, a trembling child in a mountain hut speaking words far too old for its years, while a hunted congregation weeps and believes. The body in the grip of the divine is a thread that runs through the whole century, and nowhere did it grip harder or stranger than in a quiet Paris cemetery, where the faithful began asking to be crushed. In 1730s Paris, a humble cemetery became the centre of one of the oddest religious crazes in French history. Pilgrims gathered at the tomb of a saintly deacon and began experiencing violent convulsions, which they took as signs of divine grace. Soon believers were requesting what they called aid, asking to be struck, pressed, and crushed with heavy objects to intensify their holy fits, apparently without lasting harm. Crowds came to watch, the authorities panicked, and eventually the king simply ordered the cemetery closed. A witty soul scrawled a note on the gate joking that God was hereby forbidden from performing miracles in this location. The tomb belonged to a deeply respected deacon of an austere and controversial religious faction within the French church, a man renowned for his piety and his charity to the poor. When he died, his grave in the parish cemetery quickly became a place of pilgrimage, and pilgrims began reporting cures and, more spectacularly, overwhelming physical seizures that swept over them as they prayed. To the faithful, these convulsions were not illness. They were the visible touch of grace, proof that heaven was at work at this humble spot, and proof, conveniently, that God favoured their embattled faction over its powerful enemies. Word spread, and the crowds grew, and the phenomena grew right along with them, because these things always do. What began as spontaneous trembling escalated into elaborate public displays. Believers would writhe, contort, cry out, and enter states of apparent ecstasy, and a whole supporting culture developed around them. Assistants would attend to the convulsing faithful, and it is here that the story takes its genuinely startling turn, because the convulsionaires began to insist that their fits could only be relieved by receiving what they called succour, meaning heavy physical blows and pressure. This is the part that reads like something invented, and yet it is well documented. Believers requested and received astonishing amounts of what any outside observer would call abuse. They asked to be beaten, to have heavy weights and even large stones laid upon them, to be pressed and struck with force, all in the conviction that this violence was necessary to complete the divine experience and that grace would protect them from real harm. Onlookers reported people enduring blows that ought to have caused grievous injury and rising apparently unhurt, which naturally only deepened the sense that something supernatural was afoot. Predictably, The whole spectacle horrified the authorities, both church and crown, who saw a disorderly, uncontrollable mass phenomenon attached to a religious faction they already distrusted, drawing enormous crowds to a Paris churchyard. It had every ingredient guaranteed to alarm a government: popular fervour, factional loyalty, public disorder, and claims of miracles that undercut official authority. So the king did the direct thing. In the early 1730s, he ordered the cemetery shut and sealed off entirely, cutting the faithful off from their sacred ground. And it is here that history hands us its single best punchline, delivered by an anonymous Parisian wit. Someone reportedly posted a note at the closed gate, joking that by order of the king, God was forbidden to perform any further miracles in this place. It is the perfect, deadpan encapsulation of the whole affair, a government solemnly attempting to regulate the supernatural by locking a gate. You cannot legislate ecstasy, but you can, apparently, at least try to change the locks. The convulsionaires believed suffering brought them closer to the divine. Our next figure took that same idea, that the road to salvation runs through pain and transgression, and built an entire messianic career on turning the moral order completely upside down. Some cults ask their followers to be pure. Jacob Frank, an 18th century self-declared messiah, asked for the exact opposite. He preached that the path to redemption ran directly through transgression, that one had to descend into forbidden acts in order to break the power of the old moral law and usher in a new age. Thousands followed him across the shifting borders of Eastern Europe as he reinvented himself again and again, eventually converting his flock en masse to Catholicism, while retaining his own secret hold over them. Frank understood something dark and durable, that a promise of forbidden freedom can bind people tighter than any rule. He arrived, in a sense, in the wreckage of a hope you already heard shatter. The great messianic movement that ended when its leader chose the turban had not entirely died. It had gone underground, splintered, and mutated into stranger forms, and out of that murky afterlife came Frank, who presented himself as the continuation and fulfillment of that broken promise. He inherited a wounded, waiting audience still aching for redemption, and still primed to believe that the Messiah might arrive in a disguise no ordinary mind would recognize. Frank made that disguise his entire brand. His teaching was a deliberate inversion of everything his followers had been raised to hold sacred. Redemption, he argued, could not be reached by obeying the old law, because the old law was precisely the prison that had to be broken. To free the world, one had to descend, to pass through the forbidden, to trample the very rules most fiercely, because only by exhausting and shattering the old moral order could the new age be born. It is the antinomian loophole you met among the free spirits and the alleged ranters, but weaponized, turned from a private permission into a program, a messianic mission of sacred rule-breaking. This is a genuinely disturbing idea, and Frank knew exactly how powerful it was. A rule binds you by forbidding, but a leader who commands you to break the rules binds you far more tightly, because now your transgression is his to define, his to authorize, and his to hold over you. Every forbidden act a follower committed under Frank's direction was a thread tying that follower to Frank alone, since the ordinary world would never understand or forgive it. He had built a community whose members could not easily go home, because he had made sure they had burned the way back themselves. His career was a masterpiece of shape-shifting survival across a dangerous religious landscape. Pursued and condemned, he led his followers through a series of dramatic public reinventions, at one point overseeing their mass conversion to Catholicism, which offered protection and respectability, while he quietly retained his own secret authority over them beneath the new surface. Like the familists you met earlier, the Frankists learned to wear the official costume of the surrounding society. Unlike the familists, they did so under the absolute control of a living leader who claimed to be divine. Frank lived, in the end, in considerable style, surrounded by his devoted court, having transmuted spiritual authority into something very like a princely household. His movement faded and dispersed after him, absorbed and half forgotten, but the mechanism he perfected has never gone out of use. The promise of forbidden freedom, offered by a leader who alone decide what freedom means, is one of the strongest bindings a human being can be talked into. That intoxicating spin between ecstasy and control leads us out of the courts and countryside of Central Europe and eastward into the hidden villages of Russia, where whole secret congregations spun themselves into the divine in candlelit rooms. Deep in the Russian countryside, hidden from the eyes of the official church, a secretive sect called the Klisti practiced a form of worship built on ecstatic ritual. Gathering in secret, they would spin, sway, and whirl in candlelit rooms until they collapsed in a trance they believed brought them face to face with the divine spirit. They lived outwardly as devout, ordinary Orthodox peasants, which kept them concealed for well over a century. Their rituals inspired endless rumour and dread among outsiders, and their shadow would later touch the Russian court itself in ways that changed history. Their central conviction was a striking one. They believed that the divine spirit could descend and dwell directly within a living human being, and that certain people among them had become living vessels of God, even living Christs, with women among them revered as embodiments of the Divine Mother. This meant that holiness for the Klisti was not something mediated through the grand official church with its priests and icons and hierarchy. It was something you could experience directly in a plain room in your own trembling body if you knew the way to summon it. And the way, they believed, was ecstatic motion. Their secret gatherings became the heart of the sect. Away from the eyes of the authorities, believers would assemble and begin their worship, singing and then moving, swaying and turning, the motion building and building into a whirling collective ecstasy. They spun until the ordinary world blurred and fell away, until exhaustion and rhythm and fervour carried them into a trance state they understood as the direct visitation of the Holy Spirit. To collapse in that state was not to faint. It was to arrive, to be filled, to have touched God without a single priest standing in between. Alongside the ecstasy ran a stern discipline, which is a combination you have seen before in this long night. The devout Klisti embraced severe self-denial in daily life, renouncing many ordinary pleasures and comforts, holding their bodies to a strict asceticism precisely so that the moment of ecstatic release would burn all the brighter. It is the same paradox that ran through the convulsionaires and the whirling devotees of many faiths, the pairing of harsh restraint with overwhelming release. The tighter the coil, the higher the spring. Their secrecy was their armour, and it worked astonishingly well. Because they attended the official Orthodox services like everyone else, confessed, and lived as unremarkable pious villagers, they were nearly impossible for the authorities to identify, let alone suppress. Just like the familists in the West, they had discovered that the surest protection was not a fortress wall but a perfectly ordinary face, and they held that face in place for generations, while the outside world traded lurid and largely invented rumours about what supposedly happened once the doors were shut and the candles lit. Those rumours, wild and fearful, ensured the Klisti a dark reputation far larger than their numbers, and their name would echo forward in a way they could never have foreseen. In the twilight of Imperial Russia, a wandering holy man of enormous and sinister influence over the royal family would be accused, rightly or wrongly, of ties to exactly this kind of hidden ecstatic underworld, and the whispered word Klist would trail after him into the collapse of an empire. A secret village sect had improbably brushed the throne itself. But if the Klisti pursued the divine through wild motion, a darker offshoot of that same hidden Russian world pursued it through a stillness far more terrible, by cutting away the very capacity to sin. And then there was the darkest offshoot of that Russian mystical world, the Skoptsi, who took the idea of conquering bodily temptation to a devastating literal extreme through self-mutilation. Founded in the late 1700s and led by a man who claimed to be both a returned emperor and a living god, the sect believed that removing the flesh's ability to sin was the surest road to salvation. Astonishingly, the movement grew to tens of thousands and included prosperous merchants and officials. We will tread carefully here, because behind the strangeness were real people who believed, with total sincerity, that they were saving their own souls. Their reasoning began from a premise many faiths share, that the desires of the body are the great obstacle to holiness, the constant tug that pulls the soul away from God. Countless religious traditions have wrestled with that tug through fasting, celibacy, and discipline. The Skoptsi simply refused half measures. If the flesh was the enemy of the soul, they reasoned, then the truest and most permanent victory was not to resist temptation over and over across a lifetime, but to remove its source entirely and be done with the war forever. It was ascetic logic followed, with terrible consistency, all the way to its final and irreversible conclusion. We will leave the specifics in respectful shadow and speak only of what it meant to them. To undergo the sect's central act was, in their eyes, to receive a kind of baptism of fire, to be sealed, purified, and set permanently free from the pull of desire. Those who submitted to it were regarded as the truly holy, the fully committed, marked out from the ordinary believers. The whole framework transformed an act of mutilation into, for them, an act of liberation. And that reframing is the truly chilling thing. The way a coherent spiritual argument can lead sincere people somewhere so devastating. What defies easy explanation is how the movement grew and who joined it. This was not a handful of desperate outcasts. The Skoptsi spread across the Russian Empire and endured for well over a century, and their ranks came to include not only peasants, but prosperous merchants, tradesmen, and men of some standing, people with comfortable lives and much to lose. Some were drawn in part because the sect's discipline and mutual loyalty made its members reliable and successful in business, so that belonging brought worldly prosperity, even as it demanded the ultimate bodily sacrifice. Wealth and self-denial tangled together yet again. Their founder set the pattern, a man who made the audacious double claim to be both a returned Russian emperor, cloaked in a persistent legend that a certain dead ruler had secretly survived, and a divine redeemer come to lead his people to salvation. It is the recipe from our first segment in one of its purest forms, a leader claiming supernatural identity, a promise of ultimate purity, and a devoted community bound by a sacrifice so extreme that no member could ever casually walk away from what they had done and become. The cost of leaving was written permanently into the body. The state and church regarded them with horror and persecuted them relentlessly, exiling members to the empire's far edges. Yet the sect persisted stubbornly for generations, carried by absolute conviction. The Skoptsi are perhaps the most sobering stop on our entire journey, not because they were monstrous, but because they were so terribly sincere. They took an idea about purity that milder faiths hold gently, and they believed it so completely that they were willing to pay any price at all. Sincerity, this whole night keeps insisting, is not the opposite of danger. It is often its engine. From these hidden, self-denying believers labouring at the empire's margins, we turn now to the opposite extreme entirely, to a cult built not in secret villages but by a government in broad daylight, in the heart of a revolution that had decided to invent religion from scratch. Not every cult grows in secret. During the French Revolution, the state itself tried to build one from scratch. As revolutionaries tore down the old church, they replaced it first with the cult of reason, holding festivals in Notre Dame where an actress was dressed as the goddess of liberty. Then Robespierre, finding all a touch too godless, launched his own rival cult of the Supreme Being with an enormous public ceremony he personally led. Within weeks he was overthrown and executed, and his tidy new religion evaporated almost overnight. It turns out inventing a faith by government committee is even harder than it sounds. The impulse behind it was, in its way, understandable. The revolution had set out to sweep away the entire old order, and the church had been one of the mightiest pillars of that order, immensely wealthy, deeply entangled with a fallen monarchy, and in the eyes of the radicals, a machine for keeping ordinary people obedient and afraid. So they went after it with revolutionary thoroughness, seizing its property, subordinating its clergy, and stripping away its authority. But that left a gaping hole, because a society still needs something to gather around, some shared meaning to fill the space where the old faith had stood. The radicals decided to build a replacement. The first attempt was the cult of reason, a deliberately godless civic religion exalting liberty, reason, and the nation itself in place of any deity. Its high point was a grand festival staged in the great cathedral of Paris, temporarily rechristened a Temple of Reason, where the old religious imagery was pushed aside in favour of revolutionary spectacle, and a living woman, reportedly an actress, was dressed and presented as a personification of liberty enthroned before the crowd. It was religion reimagined as patriotic theatre, worship with the gods swapped out for an idea and a costume. This did not sit well with everyone, and least of all with the revolution's most austere and powerful figure, Robespierre. He found the militant atheism of the cult of reason both distasteful and politically reckless, believing that a society needed some notion of a higher power to hold it together and to underwrite public virtue. So he engineered a rival, the cult of the Supreme Being, which acknowledged a vague deity and the immortality of the soul, while still rejecting the old church entirely. It was to be a rational revolutionary faith, tidy and uplifting, and firmly under the right management, namely his. He inaugurated it with a colossal public festival that he personally led, presiding over the ceremony in a manner that struck many observers as alarmingly grand for a man who was supposed to be a servant of the Republic. Robespierre, standing at the head of his own new religion, orchestrating the worship of a supreme being he had helped design by decree, was an image that made even his allies deeply uneasy. A leader inventing a faith and installing himself at its centre is by now a warning sign you can recognize in your sleep, and his colleagues recognized it wide awake. Within a matter of weeks, the political ground collapsed beneath him. He was overthrown, arrested and executed, and his carefully engineered religion, so freshly minted and so bound up with his own person, simply dissolved along with him, an established faith with essentially no believers left the moment its founder lost his head. The cult of reason and the cult of the Supreme Being stand as history's clearest demonstration that you cannot simply legislate a religion into existence from a committee room, however grand the festival. Belief, it turns out, does not take orders. If a revolutionary government struggled to conjure a cult into being on purpose, our next case shows the opposite difficulty. A supposed cult that may have been conjured into being largely by the fearful accounting of the outsiders who set out to destroy it. Across the roads of historical India moved a menace that would become one of the most infamous and debated groups in colonial history, the Thuggee, bands accused of befriending travellers before ritually strangling and robbing them, supposedly in devotion to a goddess. British authorities in the 1830s launched a sweeping campaign to hunt them down, and the very word thug entered the English language from these accounts. Modern historians now debate fiercely how organised or how real the network truly was, versus how much was shaped by colonial fear and record-keeping. The truth, as so often, lies somewhere in the uneasy fog between them. The story as it was told by the colonial authorities is genuinely chilling, and it was told with tremendous confidence. According to those accounts, the Thuggee were hereditary bands of killers who operated along the trade and pilgrimage routes, and their method was patience itself. Rather than ambush travellers openly, they would join them as fellow wayfarers, walking alongside them for days, sharing food and conversation and campfires, earning trust mile by mile. Then, at a chosen moment, when the victims were relaxed and unsuspecting, they would strike, killing swiftly and silently, robbing the bodies and disposing of them with practiced efficiency before melting back onto the road. What lifted the tale from ordinary banditry into something far more disturbing was the religious framing. The authorities described the killings not as mere robbery but as ritual acts, devotions offered to a goddess of destruction, with the murderers understanding their grim work as a sacred calling, passed down through families and bound by secret rites and signs. This transformed the Thuggee, in the colonial imagination, from criminals into a full-blown murderous cult, a hidden brotherhood of holy killers hiding in plain sight along every road, which is a nightmare almost perfectly designed to justify sweeping intervention. And sweeping intervention is exactly what followed. In the 1830s, a determined British official led a large and systematic campaign to exterminate the Thuggee, establishing a special apparatus to hunt them, gather intelligence, and prosecute suspects across huge stretches of territory. Vast numbers of men were arrested, tried, and executed or imprisoned, often on the testimony of accused members who informed on others in exchange for their own lives. The campaign was hailed as a triumph of order over savage secret crime, and it burned the word thug permanently into the English language as a term for a brutal criminal. But here is where the modern historian steps in with a raised hand and a great many questions, because the whole edifice rests almost entirely on records produced by the very people conducting the crackdown. When your only detailed account of a secret cult comes from the officials who hunted it, extracted confessions from frightened prisoners, and had every incentive to portray the threat as vast, organised, and uniquely sinister, you're entitled to wonder how much of the picture reflects reality, and how much reflects the fears and assumptions of the outsiders drawing it. Ordinary highway robbery certainly existed. Whether it was a unified, goddess-worshipping brotherhood, or a patchwork of unrelated crime reframed as a single monstrous conspiracy, is far less certain. That uncertainty is precisely why the Thuggee belong here, at the hinge of our long night, alongside the possibly invented ranters. Together they pose the most unsettling question this whole subject has to offer. Sometimes a disturbing cult is a real and secret danger, and sometimes it is a shape that frightened, powerful people project onto the darkness because they need an enemy to explain their world and justify their grip on it. Telling the two apart centuries later may be the hardest task of all. In the 1840s, a mild-mannered American farmer named William Miller did the math on his Bible and arrived at a thrilling conclusion: the world would end, and soon. Tens of thousands of followers across the United States believed him, gave away their belongings, and gathered to await the return of Christ, eventually settling on a date in October of 1844. When the sun rose the next morning on a stubbornly intact world, the moment became known with heartbreaking honesty as the Great Disappointment. What is remarkable is not that the prophecy failed, but how many believers simply recalculated and kept the faith. Miller himself was an unlikely prophet, and that is part of what made him so persuasive. He was not a wild-eyed street preacher or a self-crowned messiah in fine robes. He was a settled, respectable farmer and veteran, a careful and rather cautious man who came to his conclusions slowly, through years of methodical study of Scripture, working through the prophetic passages the way you might work through a difficult ledger. He was not selling ecstasy or forbidden freedom. He was offering arithmetic. And there is something uniquely convincing about a calm man with a pencil who insists the numbers simply add up. And the numbers, as he presented them, pointed to a date. Miller calculated that the Great Return was due within a specific window, and as the movement grew and the pressure mounted, his followers eventually narrowed the expectation to a particular day in the autumn of 1844. This is where the recipe from our first night gains a feature that is always both thrilling and fatal: a deadline. Vague promises can drift on forever, but a fixed date creates unbearable excitement and equally unbearable risk, because a date, unlike a mood, can be proven wrong by the simple rising of the sun. The movement it produced was enormous and genuinely sincere. Tens of thousands across the United States embraced the message, and many acted on it with total conviction, settling their debts, giving away possessions, and in some cases leaving crops unharvested in the fields, because why gather a harvest for a world that wouldn't be there to eat it? They gathered in homes and meeting halls as the appointed day approached, filled with a joyful, trembling certainty that they were about to witness the end of all earthly sorrow and the beginning of glory. It was hope at its most complete and most vulnerable. Then the day came, and then the day went, and the world, with its usual indifference to human scheduling, simply carried on. The morning after was a scene of shattered devastation, and the believers themselves gave it the plain, aching name by which it is still known: the Great Disappointment. Imagine the specific quality of that grief, to have given away your goods and steeled your soul for paradise, and to find yourself standing in the ordinary cold dawn with an empty larder and a world that refused to end. Contemporaries described weeping that lasted for days, but recall the strangest finding from our very first, that a failed prophecy does not always destroy belief. It often reshapes it. Many Millerites did fall away in bitterness, yet a remarkable number did not. Instead, they went back to the study, re-examined the calculation, and concluded that the date had been correct but the event misunderstood, that something significant had indeed happened, only in the heavens rather than on earth. From that reinterpretation grew lasting religious movements that endure to this day, built on the ashes of a disappointment rather than destroyed by it. The mind, faced with a world that would not end, rebuilt the prophecy instead of surrendering it. the Millerites gave away their goods in joyful hope and survived the letdown. Our next story begins from that same act of destroying one's own possessions for a promised new world, but it does not end in mere disappointment. It ends in famine, and it asks to be told softly. Now the tone grows quieter, because this one ends in genuine tragedy. In 1856, a young Xhosa girl named Nonkawus in southern Africa brought a prophecy that if the people destroyed their cattle and grain, their ancestors would rise, drive out the colonizers, and bring a new world of plenty. Caught between hope and despair under colonial pressure, many of her people did exactly that, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of cattle. The new world did not come. What came instead was famine, and tens of thousands died. It is a story told with sorrow of a desperate people reaching for a miracle that betrayed them. To understand it, you must first understand the weight already pressing down. The Xhosa people had endured a long series of grinding wars against colonial expansion, losing land, autonomy, and lives across decades of relentless pressure. Their whole way of life was built around cattle, which were not merely wealth and food, but the very centre of their society, their measure of status, their bonds of kinship, their link to the ancestors. And on top of the wars, a devastating disease had begun sweeping through the herds, killing the animals and deepening a mood of crisis that already felt apocalyptic. Into that suffering, a prophecy arrived. The messenger was a girl in her mid-teens, who reported that she'd encountered the spirits of the ancestors near a river, and that they had brought a promise and a demand. If the people would prove their faith by destroying their cattle and ceasing to cultivate their fields, then on an appointed day the ancestors and heroes of old would rise again. The dead herds would be replaced by new and healthy ones beyond counting. The granaries would fill, and the invaders would be swept into the sea. The world would be made whole again, and the long humiliation would end. It was a vision of total restoration offered to a people who had lost almost everything. The community was torn, and the division ran deep and bitter. Many believed and obeyed, and set about the terrible work of destroying their own sustenance as an act of faith, killing their cattle and leaving their fields unplanted, trusting utterly in the promised renewal. Others refused, insisting the prophecy was ruin dressed as salvation, and the two sides fell into painful conflict. But belief spread, driven by desperation and by the sheer scale of the hope on offer, and over the following months an enormous number of cattle, hundreds of thousands of them, were slaughtered, and the harvests were forsaken. The appointed day arrived, and here the story allows no comfort and no joke, because what followed was exactly what the doubters had feared. The sun did not darken, the dead did not rise, the herds did not return, and the sea kept the colonizers exactly where they were. Instead came the inevitable arithmetic of a people who had destroyed their own food supply. Famine descended with horrifying speed and completeness, and tens of thousands died of starvation, while many survivors, utterly destitute, were forced off their remaining land in search of any means to live. A prophecy of restoration had produced one of the worst catastrophes in the people's history. It would be easy and wrong to reach for mockery here, and we will not. This was not foolishness. It was a proud and battered people, cornered by real and worsening disaster, reaching for the one hope that promised to reverse it all at once. The tragedy of the cattle killing is the tragedy woven quietly through this entire night, that the more unbearable the present, the more irresistible an impossible promise becomes, and the higher the price a desperate people will pay to believe it. that same terrible pattern, hope offered to the cornered and the grieving, will return before we are done. But first, mercifully, we can step into gentler shadows and cross to an English country house where the scandal was considerable, but the harm this time was mostly to dignity. Let's return to lighter shadows, with a very English sort of scandal. In Victorian Somerset, a clergyman founded a private religious community called the Abode of Love, where devoted and often wealthy female followers lived in comfortable seclusion under his spiritual guidance. When he died, a successor took over and, in 1902, calmly announced to a startled London congregation that he was in fact the returned Christ. The public reaction was somewhere between outrage and delight. The community drifted on for decades in its leafy compound, a genteel scandal that the neighbours discussed in scandalised whispers over very strong tea. The whole affair had a distinctly comfortable flavour from the start, which sets it apart from most of what you've heard tonight. There were no cliffs, no clubs, no famine, no iron cages. There was instead a substantial country house set in pleasant grounds, well appointed and discreetly walled, into which a charismatic clergyman gathered a devoted following. The name they gave the place translates roughly to the Abode of Love, and it was intended to be exactly that, a haven set apart from a fallen world, where the faithful could live in spiritual harmony under the guidance of a man they regarded as uniquely touched by God. The founder had left the mainstream church after his ideas grew too unorthodox for it, and he taught that a new spiritual age was dawning and that he stood at the centre of it. His community attracted a notably large number of women, many of them from comfortable and even wealthy backgrounds, who brought their devotion and, not incidentally, their money into the fold. This combination, a magnetic male spiritual leader, a walled retreat, and a congregation of devoted and well-off women, generated precisely the sort of Victorian rumour you would expect, and the Abode of Love was whispered about across England for decades. When the founder died, the community did not dissolve, which in itself is telling, since it suggests the followers were bound to the faith and the fellowship as much as to the man. Leadership passed to a successor, another clergyman, and it was he who supplied the episode's most gloriously audacious moment. In the early years of the 20th century, addressing a congregation in London, he announced with perfect composure that he was the returned Christ, come again as promised. To simply stand up in a respectable hall and declare oneself the second coming in front of a crowd expecting an ordinary sermon takes a certain magnificent nerve, whatever else you make of it. The reaction was a very British blend of scandalised fury and helpless fascination. There was uproar, there was ridicule, there were furious denunciations, and there was also, unmistakably, an enormous appetite for hearing every last detail. The newspapers feasted. And yet, remarkably, the community endured through all of it, retreating back to its comfortable Somerset compound and carrying on for decades more, gradually shrinking and aging but never quite scandalised out of existence, a persistent leafy curiosity that outlasted the outrage of the crowds who had come to gawk. The Agapemonites earn their place tonight not through cruelty or tragedy, but through the sheer, serene audacity of the claim at their heart, and through the reminder that the recipe works just as well in a genteel English garden as on a mountainside or in a besieged city. A confident voice, a devoted circle, and a promise too grand to check. It simply happened here over tea, rather than at the point of a sword. From this comfortable and bloodless scandal, we turn to a movement whose members also sought a life apart, but who defended that life with a fervour that produced flames, protest, and one of the strangest standoffs of the modern age. Among the many sects that fled the Russian Empire were the Doukhobors, peaceful spirit wrestlers who rejected the church, the army and worldly authority, and who eventually resettled across the ocean in Canada. Most lived quiet, hard-working, deeply communal lives. But a radical faction known as the Sons of Freedom developed a dramatic and startling method of protest against government interference, staging nude demonstrations and on occasion setting fire to property, including their own. For much of the 20th century, Canadian authorities and this small stubborn group were locked in a slow, strange and often heartbreaking standoff over faith and freedom. Their name means something like spirit wrestlers, a label originally flung at them as an insult and proudly kept. At the heart of their faith was the conviction that God dwells within each person directly, which made the whole apparatus of the official church, its priests, its icons, its hierarchy, unnecessary and even corrupting. From this flowed a stubborn rejection of external authority in general. They would not bow to the church, and crucially, they would not bear arms for the state, holding a deep pacifism that put them squarely and repeatedly at odds with governments that expected young men to serve in armies. That refusal made them enemies in Imperial Russia, where their pacifism and defiance drew harsh persecution, and in a famous act of witness a large body of them gathered and burned their weapons rather than used them against fellow human beings. Their plight attracted sympathy abroad, including from a certain towering Russian novelist who helped fund their escape, and in the closing years of the 19th century thousands emigrated across the ocean to the Canadian prairies, hoping to find at last a place where they could live communally and be left in peace to follow their conscience. Peace, however, proved elusive, because the very authority they rejected followed them in new forms. The Canadian state expected them to register land individually, swear oaths, and send their children to government schools, all of which collided directly with their communal, anti-authority convictions. Most Doukhobors adapted and endured, building industrious shared settlements and quietly holding their beliefs. But a radical faction hardened into the group known as the Sons of Freedom, who decided that passive endurance was not enough, and that dramatic protest was the only faithful response to a state that would not leave their souls alone. Their methods were extraordinary and, to outsiders, baffling. To protest attachment to material possessions and defy government pressure, they staged mass demonstrations in the nude, a spectacle that scandalized the surrounding society and guaranteed headlines. And in their fiercest moments they turned to fire, burning property, including sometimes their own homes and goods, as a radical statement that worldly possessions and coercive institutions held no claim over them. It was protest as purifying flame, a conviction that they could not be bound by what they were willing to burn. What followed was one of the strangest and saddest standoffs of the modern age, stretching across much of the 20th century, a slow, grinding conflict of arrests, seizures, the forced removal of children into distant institutions, and repeated cycles of protest and punishment. Neither side could make the other yield, because the state was defending its authority, and the Sons of Freedom were defending their souls, and those two things do not compromise easily. The Doukhobors remind us that the clash between individual conscience and collective power is not confined to ancient mountains or medieval cities. It can smoulder, quite literally in the modern world, on a windswept prairie well within living memory. That same collision between a people's sacred hope and a state that sees only a threat returns now in its most sorrowful form on the high plains of North America in a dance meant to bring a whole vanishing world back to life. On the plains of North America in 1890, a Paiute holy man named Wovoka shared a vision of hope to peoples whose entire world was being destroyed. If they performed a sacred circle dance, he taught, the buffalo would return, the ancestors would rise, and the land would be restored. The ghost dance spread swiftly among desperate and grieving nations, but United States authorities saw the movement as a threat, and their fear helped lead to the massacre at Wounded Knee, where hundreds of Lakota, many of them women and children, were killed. This is not a story we laugh at. It is one we sit with. To feel the weight of the vision, you have to feel the depth of the loss it answered. The native nations of the plains had endured the near-total collapse of their world within a single generation. The vast buffalo herds that had sustained their entire way of life had been slaughtered almost to extinction. Their lands had been taken, their peoples confined to reservations, their children pressured into distant schools, their old freedoms crushed. Disease and hunger stalked the confined communities. It was by any measure an apocalypse already in progress, a world visibly ending in real time, and the grief of it is almost beyond imagining. Into that grief came Yovoka, a Paiute holy man who, during a period of serious illness around an eclipse, experienced a profound vision. He returned with a message of hope and, importantly, of peace. He taught that if the people lived rightly, in honesty and without violence, and if they performed a particular sacred dance, a circling dance carried out faithfully over days, then the great renewal would come. The dead ancestors would return, the buffalo would fill the plains once more, and the old world of plenty and freedom would be restored, sweeping away the sorrows of the present. It asked not for war, but for faith and for dancing. The message spread with astonishing speed across many nations, carried by messengers and pilgrims hungry for exactly this kind of hope, and it took hold with particular intensity among the Lakota, who adapted it to their own circumstances and grief. Communities gathered to perform the dance, moving in great circles for hours and days, some falling into trances in which they glimpsed the promised world and their lost loved ones. Among some Lakota arose the belief that special garments worn in the dance might even protect the wearer from harm, a poignant detail that speaks to how much protection these communities so desperately needed. But to the United States authorities watching the reservations, the sight of large numbers of grieving, fervent people gathering to dance for the end of the current order was not a spiritual revival. It was a threat, and it was met with alarm and a heavy hand. Fear escalated on the official side, troops were deployed, and tension mounted toward catastrophe. It culminated at a place called Wounded Knee in the winter of 1890, where an attempt to disarm a Lakota encampment erupted into a massacre, and hundreds of Lakota people, including many women and children, were killed. The dance for the renewal of the world ended in one of the darkest days in the nation's history. There is no punchline here, and there should not be one. The ghost dance was not delusion in any mocking sense. It was a peaceful, sacred, deeply human response to an unbearable loss, an attempt to dream a destroyed world back into being. That it was met with gunfire rather than understanding is the tragedy, and it belongs on the same shelf as the cattle killing, a solemn reminder that behind the word cult there are so often real people, grieving and cornered, reaching for the only hope left to them. From that profound sorrow we return gently to the smaller and stranger corners of the modern age, to an ordinary English town where a widow quietly decided she was the daughter of God. Back to gentler eccentricity, in an ordinary English town in the early 20th century, a widow named Mabel Baltrop came to believe she was the daughter of God and took the name Octavia. She gathered a small, mostly female community around her, convinced that a sealed box left behind by an 18th century prophetess contained the secret to saving the world, provided that a group of bishops agreed to open it under strict conditions. They also sold squares of healing linen through the post. The society survived for decades, patiently waiting for bishops who never quite came, tending a garden they believed was the original site of Eden. The setting could hardly be more delightfully ordinary. Not a mountain, not a compound, not a besieged city, but a quiet, respectable English town of tidy houses and neat gardens, the sort of place where the most dramatic event of a normal week is a disagreement about a hedge. And it was here, in a perfectly unremarkable house, that a clergyman's widow, a woman of some education who had known real grief and hardship, arrived at the conviction that she was a divine figure, the long-awaited daughter of God, and took a new and celestial name to match. Around her gathered a community, small in number and largely composed of women, many of them widows and spinsters of comfortable means, who found in the society something the wider world had not offered them: purpose, importance, sisterhood, and a leader who assured them they stood at the very centre of the divine plan for the salvation of humanity. In a period when so many capable women were left on the margins of public life, the appeal of belonging to a movement that placed them at the heart of cosmic events should not be underestimated. It gave them a role, and roles were in short supply. Their central hope rested on a genuinely curious inheritance, a sealed box supposedly left behind by an earlier prophetess, said to contain writings that would resolve the world's troubles. The condition attached to it was wonderfully specific. The box could only be opened at a time of national crisis, and only in the presence of a substantial gathering of senior bishops of the Church of England, assembled together for the purpose. The society devoted enormous energy to petitioning the bishops to come and open it, and the bishops, with the serene immovability of established institutions everywhere, declined to oblige. Alongside the waiting, the society ran a remarkable enterprise of healing. Their leader would breathe upon and bless small squares of linen, which were then cut up and distributed eventually by post to believers around the world, who used them by dipping them in water for protection and cure against all manner of ills. Through this quiet postal ministry, the society's reach extended far beyond its little English town, drawing in distant adherents and correspondents from across the globe, a modest garden movement with a surprisingly long thread connecting it to the wider world. They also believed, with charming conviction, that their own garden was the literal original site of Eden, and they tended it accordingly, waiting patiently through the decades for the bishops, for the opening of the box and for the salvation of the world, none of which arrived on schedule. The Panacea Society harmed no one, and eventually simply dwindled as its faithful aged, leaving behind a preserved house, a still-sealed box, and one of the sweetest and oddest footnotes in this entire history. Sometimes the recipe produces not tragedy or terror, but only a quiet, patient, deeply sincere, waiting for a knock at the door that never comes. That yearning to summon a promised abundance, whether from a sealed box or from the sky itself, takes us now to the far side of the world, to islands where communities watched wealth arrive as if by magic and set about trying to call it back. In the islands of Melanesia, Particularly around the era of the World Wars, a remarkable set of belief movements arose that scholars later called cargo cults. Having watched foreign militaries arrive with astonishing quantities of goods that appeared as if by magic, some communities developed rituals to summon that abundance back, building symbolic landing strips and towers and awaiting the return of a benefactor. We approach this with respect, not mockery, because for the people involved these were sincere and coherent responses to an overwhelming encounter with the outside world. Some of these beliefs endure as living faiths to this very day. Set aside first the faintly patronizing tone the popular version of this story usually carries, because the reality is far more interesting and far more reasonable than the caricature. Imagine your position. You live in a community with its own ancient and complete understanding of how the world works, how goods are made, where wealth comes from, and how the spirits and ancestors move within it. And then, into that world, arrive outsiders who possess an almost incomprehensible abundance of manufactured goods, tools, tinned food, cloth, machines, and who obtain all of it without farming, hunting, or crafting any of it before your eyes. It simply arrives, delivered from the sky and the sea. Any thoughtful person would seek to explain this, and the explanations that arose were logical extensions of existing belief. If these outsiders were receiving vast wealth that they plainly did not produce themselves, then it must be coming from somewhere, perhaps from the ancestors or spirits, and it must have been diverted or intercepted, meant rightfully for the local people, but somehow captured by the newcomers. The task, then, was to perform the correct actions, the right rituals and preparations to summon that abundance to its proper destination. This was not foolishness. It was reasoning applied earnestly to a genuinely bewildering situation. The rituals that followed have become famous, and they had a striking internal logic. The people had observed that the outsiders received their goods after performing certain activities, building strips of cleared ground, standing towers with wires, wearing particular uniforms, marching in formation, speaking into boxes. So some communities reproduce these actions with great care and devotion, constructing their own runways in the hope that cargo-bearing craft would land, raising poles and structures to draw the abundance down, and drilling in imitation of the strange marching they had seen, all as a form of ritual invitation to the promised wealth. Central to many of these movements was the figure of a returning benefactor, sometimes a named individual, real or legendary, who was expected to come back bringing the great cargo and inaugurating a new age of plenty and dignity, often accompanied by the expectation that the existing order would be overturned in the community's favor. In this you can hear the same deep chord that has sounded through so much of tonight, the promise of a coming figure and a coming abundance that will set a hard world right, the messianic hope taking a form shaped precisely by these islands and this encounter. What is most striking is the endurance and sincerity of these beliefs. Far from being a passing confusion, some of these movements developed into stable, organized faiths with their own doctrines and observances, and a number of them persist as living religions in the present day, tended by communities who hold them with the same seriousness anyone holds a faith. We give them, then, not a smirk but a respectful nod, as one of humanity's most fascinating examples of the mind making earnest sense of the overwhelming and the new. From the Pacific we cross to the United States, to a very different attempt to build a new world, one that sought not to summon abundance from the sky, but to reorganize the most intimate arrangements of human life itself, and somehow ended up making the tableware. In the 1840s, a charismatic thinker named John Humphrey Noyes founded a utopian community in upstate New York, built on ideas that scandalized respectable America. The Oneida community practiced what they called complex marriage, in which the whole group was considered wedded together, and they held regular sessions of mutual criticism in which members sat and received frank assessments of their faults from the entire community. Somehow it functioned for over 30 years, and here is the twist that history loves. When the community finally dissolved, it reorganized into a company that became famous for making perfectly ordinary silverware. Its founder was a man of formidable intellect and conviction who had arrived at a striking theological position that a form of spiritual perfection was actually attainable in this life, that a sufficiently dedicated community could free itself from sin and live in a genuinely redeemed state here and now. You will notice the family resemblance to the free spirits and other perfectionist currents you met earlier in the night. But this founder pointed the idea in an unusual direction. Rather than escaping into secrecy or forbidden excess, he set out to build a rigorously organized, hard-working community that would embody perfection through total sharing. And the sharing was indeed total, extending into the most private corners of life in a way that scandalized the surrounding society. Under the doctrine of complex marriage, the community held that every man was in a sense married to every woman, and the reverse, that exclusive pair bonds and possessive romantic attachments were a form of selfishness to be overcome, and that intimate relationships were to be regulated by the community rather than by private couples. This was policed by an elaborate internal system, and it collided head-on with every convention of respectable American life, guaranteeing the community a steady supply of outrage from beyond its walls. Just as remarkable was the practice of mutual criticism, which served as the community's engine of discipline and cohesion. A member would sit before a committee, or at times the wider group, and receive a frank and unsparing assessment of their character, their faults, their pride, their failings, delivered openly by their fellows. It sounds excruciating, and no doubt often was, yet it functioned as a tool for keeping egos in check and binding the community to a shared standard, a kind of communal soul-scrubbing that members submitted to voluntarily as part of the pursuit of perfection. Belonging meant being seen, thoroughly and uncomfortably by everyone. What is genuinely surprising is how well and how long the whole intricate arrangement held together. The community was not a fleeting experiment that collapsed in a season. It endured for over 30 years, growing into a sizable, industrious, and financially successful settlement, sustaining itself through various manufacturing enterprises and maintaining its unusual social order across an entire generation. It worked, in its own extraordinary way, for far longer than most observers would ever have predicted, held together by conviction, organization, and the powerful glue of shared purpose. And then, gently, the twist that makes this story a favorite. As the founder aged and external pressure mounted and internal disagreements grew, the community eventually abandoned its radical social practices and reorganized itself, of all things, into a joint stock company. That company carried the community's name forward into an entirely respectable future as a celebrated maker of household silverware and tableware, the sort of tidy, ordinary cutlery that might sit in any family's drawer. A grand experiment in perfected communal life resolved itself, in the end, into spoons. History does love an ending like that. Our final sect also renounced ordinary family life in pursuit of a higher purity, But where Oneida eventually turned toward the world and its cutlery drawers, this last group turned quietly away from the world altogether, and in doing so chose beauty over survival. Our final sect is perhaps the gentlest and in its own way the most quietly astonishing. The Shakers, led in America by a woman named Mother Ann Lee, believed in simplicity, equality, hard work, ecstatic dancing in worship, and, fatefully, complete celibacy. They built some of the most beautiful furniture and orderly communities the world has ever seen, and they welcomed orphans and converts with genuine kindness. But a faith that forbids having children depends entirely on newcomers, and as the centuries passed, the newcomers slowed to a trickle. Today only a tiny handful remain, the last living echo of a movement that chose beauty over survival. Their formal name spoke of a second appearing of Christ, but the world came to call them Shakers for the trembling, ecstatic movement that overtook them in worship, when they would dance, shake, whirl, and sing in a fervour they understood as the working of the Spirit through the body. In this they share a distant kinship with the whirling Russian sect you met earlier, and with all the traditions across this night that found the divine in motion and release. But everything else about the Shakers was ordered, gentle and industrious, a striking pairing of wild worship with the calmest and most disciplined daily life imaginable. Their leader was a working-class Englishwoman who'd suffered profoundly, including the loss of several children in infancy, experiences that shaped her conviction that the way to holiness lay in renouncing bodily desire entirely. She led a small band of followers across the ocean to America in the late 18th century, where against all odds the movement took root and grew. That a poor, uneducated woman founded and led a lasting religious movement, and was revered by her followers as a central spiritual figure, was itself remarkable in her age, and it reflected the deep commitment to equality that ran through everything the Shakers built, and build they did, with a genius that still stops people in their tracks. The Shakers created communal villages of extraordinary order, cleanliness and harmony, and their craftsmanship became legendary. Their furniture, their buildings, their tools and their designs were marked by a spare, honest beauty, every object made with care and stripped of all excess, embodying their belief that work itself was a form of worship, and that to make a thing well was to make it holy. They were also inventive and industrious, producing goods and innovations valued far beyond their own communities, and they welcomed the orphaned and the seeking with genuine warmth. But woven into the heart of their faith was the conviction that would ultimately seal their fate, a commitment to complete celibacy. Believing that renouncing sexual relations was essential to their purity and to the spiritual life, they did not have children of their own, which meant that the survival of the entire movement depended wholly upon a steady stream of adult converts and the adoption of orphans who might choose to stay. For a time, in an age of hardship and revival, such newcomers arrived in sufficient numbers and the communities flourished and spread. As the generations passed, however, the world changed around them. Other opportunities opened for orphans and seekers, and the flow of converts thinned to almost nothing. Community by community, the villages aged and closed, until in our own time only the smallest remnant remains, a tiny handful keeping a centuries-old faith alive. There is a profound and gentle poignancy in the Shakers, a movement that produced some of the most beautiful and enduring things human hands have made, and yet, by the very logic of its purity, quietly declined to endure itself. They chose grace over continuance, and left the world more beautiful for having briefly held them. And so, having wandered from ancient wine cults to whirling villages to the makers of perfect furniture, we come at last to the question underneath every one of these strange and sincere movements, the question of why we keep answering the same call across all the centuries. So what do we make of all this? As the candle burns low and the compound goes quiet, across every century and continent the same story keeps repeating itself with different costumes. A frightened world, a confident voice, and a promise too beautiful to refuse. The disturbing truth is not that cults are made of strange people, but that they are so often made of perfectly ordinary ones, people who wanted meaning, belonging, and a little certainty in a chaotic world. The very things, in fact, that every one of us wants. And perhaps that is the real lesson these forgotten movements left behind, whispered from the ruins of their impossible dreams. Look back over the long procession you have followed tonight, and notice how little the human material changes. The Romans clutching their togas, the peasants whipping their backs against the plague, the American farmers giving away their harvests, the islanders clearing runways for the promised cargo, the grieving nations dancing to bring back a vanished world. Strip away the wine and the robes and the sealed boxes and the whirling, and underneath you find the same handful of ordinary aches again and again. Fear of a world that feels out of control, loneliness, grief, the longing to matter. These are not exotic afflictions, they are simply Tuesday. Notice too how often the followers were not the gullible and the foolish, but the thoughtful, the devout and the desperate. Merchants and officials joined the sternest sects. Careful, methodical men did the math and gave everything away. Educated widows became daughters of God. Whole proud nations reached for a miracle because the alternative was unbearable. If there is one idea worth carrying out of the ruins, it is that the capacity to be swept up is not a defect in other people. It is a standard feature of the human heart, and the honest response to that is humility rather than smugness. And yet the picture is not only dark, because tangled up in all this credulity is something genuinely admirable, even beautiful. The same impulse that built the doomed kingdom also built the Shaker's luminous furniture. The same hunger that emptied the larders also raised the peaceful cities and made the honest crafts and welcomed the orphan and the stranger. The longing for meaning that a false prophet can exploit is the very same longing that produces art, community, kindness, and hope. You cannot cut it out without cutting out the best of us along with the worst. It is one root, and it bears both kinds of fruit. So the point of a night like this is not to teach you to sneer at the believers, tucked as you are somewhere safe with the lights low. It is something quieter and more useful. It is to recognize the recipe when you meet it, as you surely will in one costume or another, because the ingredients never go out of season. A voice that is little too certain, a circle that makes you feel a little too chosen, a promise that is a little too perfect and asks at first for only a little. The warning signs are gentle every single time, right up until they are not. But that is a thought for the waking world, and the waking world can wait. For now there is nothing to decide and nothing to fear. The prophets are all long dust, their kingdoms fallen, their boxes still sealed, their runways grown over with grass. All that remains of them are these strange and sincere stories, and you, warm and safe and drifting, holding them lightly in the dark. Let them go now. Rest easy. The world did not end tonight, and it will still be here, ordinary and whole, in the morning. And so we reach the quiet end of our long wander through the strangest corners of belief. Tonight you drifted through more than 2,000 years of human longing, from the torchlit groves of ancient Rome to the whirling villages of the Russian countryside, from a besieged city that tried to become heaven to a garden in England where the faithful waited patiently for a knock that never came. You met prophets and martyrs, dreamers and dancers, the grieving and the desperate and the gently deluded, all of them reaching for something just beyond the reach of ordinary life. It would be easy to remember only the strangeness, the cliffs and the clubs, the sealed boxes and the empty larders, the kingdoms that went mad behind their walls. But underneath all of it, in every century and on every continent, you found the same tender, familiar things. People who were frightened and wanted comfort. People who were lonely and wanted to belong. People who had lost almost everything and reached with trembling hands for a promise that everything lost might somehow be restored. They were not so different from any of us. They simply answered the call. So tonight, as you lie warm and safe beneath your blankets, with the lights low and the fan humming softly, spare a gentle thought for all those hopeful, stubborn souls who came before. They believed with their whole hearts in worlds that never quite arrived, and yet in their believing they built beautiful things and cared for one another and dared to imagine that tomorrow might be kinder than today. That impulse, foolish as it sometimes was, is the very same one that has carried humanity forward through every dark and uncertain night. Because history is strange and sometimes sorrowful, but it is also proof that people are hopeful, resilient, and endlessly, wonderfully human. The prophets are all dust now, their kingdoms fallen and their runways grown over with grass. There is nothing left to fear and nothing left to decide. The world did not end tonight, and it will still be here, ordinary and whole, come the morning. So let these old stories go, rest easy, and drift softly off to sleep. Good night.